Part 2 of surviving abuse as a man, both in childhood and as an adult, now in different relationships. Now, before I really get into my early childhood, you guys have to understand the family that I was born into. So I was born in the Oakland, San Francisco area, the Bay Area of California, to a Mexican and Native American father, as well as a Korean mother. When you put all that together, this is what you get. But I do want to explain both sides of those families. And forgive me, I'm going to try not to pause this and edit because I just want to really just tell my story. So on the Korean side of the family, I was close to my mother, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother, but for whatever reason, there was a lot of animosity between my grandmother and everyone else on that side of the family, so we didn't know anyone really beyond them. It was just me and my brother with all three of those women. And I gotta say, they played a key role in giving me optimism and showing me unconditional love and what that's like in the first 4 to 5 years of my life. However, on my dad's side, it's a little bit different. So on that side, I cannot speak on behalf of all the men's characters on that side of the family, but a lot of them were involved in illegal substances, both selling and using, as well as drinking excessively, the gang violence that plagued the Bay Area in the late 90s and mid-90s. Some of them were in and out of prison and stuff like that, and quite a few of them were pretty abusive towards their spouses as well as their children. So there's a very big difference between my Korean side of the family and the Mexican side, my mother's side, and my dad's side. Now, for that reason, my mom wanted us to kind of avoid those kinds of activities and bring around that kind of trouble. So she, for the most part, kept us separate from everybody, my brother and I anyways, from my dad's side of the family for the first 4 or 5 years of my life. Now, let's get into my story, which actually starts about a month before I was born. So my biological father was involved in a lot of those things that I just mentioned, plagued my dad's side of the family. And a month before I was born, him and my mother were going through a divorce. They had been separated for some time because he had tried very hard to unalive her because of the things that he was doing. And my mother made the right decision, as hard as it was, to step away. However, that month before I was born, he found himself in a physical fight with somebody who was in a different gang than him. And what they were fighting over was a shot GUN, which I'll refer to as a pew-pew. I freaking hate that phrase, but I don't want this video to get banned, removed, or anything like that. But he got into a fight over one of those items. He ultimately lost, and it was turned on him, and he was unalived just about instantly from what I told. And he was 19 years old, about the same age as my mother. She might have been 20 at the time. So that being said, we spent the first 4 or 5 years of my childhood away from that side of the family because my mother didn't want us around that. However, she did make sure that my brother and I had a relationship with them, and she would visit them as often as we could, as long as it was safe to do so, and she was always there because she personally didn't have a relationship with family. She didn't have a sense of family growing up. She was an only child, and she struggled very much. Well, I guess she had some siblings that didn't really grow up with her, but she didn't have a sense of family. So she made sure that we stayed in contact with my dad's side because there was a lot of kids our age, and honestly, it worked. We had that sense of family. And those first 4 or 5 years of my life, I want to, give thanks to my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, because if I didn't have that, I wouldn't have been where I'm today. I wouldn't become the man that I am today because I learned unconditional love during that time, and it was a very peaceful time. But around the time we were 5 years old, my mother kind of had her hand forced and moved in with my dad's side of the family. And that meant moving into a small 3-bedroom house with about 14 plus other people. Now that sounds chaotic, and it was because we had like 5 kids to a bedroom, multiple adults to a room, including some sleeping in the living room. It was a very small home. Now as a kid, to be honest, that was great because now we were around our cousins all the time and we'd wreak havoc and all that stuff. And no matter what happened, no matter how bad or whatever the case was, we had each other. So we thrived as kids. Now that is where my mother met my stepfather. He was a relative of my biological father, and he came into the picture. Now, just like I had mentioned, there was a lot of bad things that my family was involved with. My stepfather was actually very heavily impacted by those things. When I met him, he was actually confined to a wheelchair. He was paralyzed from about here, about like just below his chest down, could not move anything, not even if he tried the hardest. And at the time, I think they could have done surgery, but it was exceptionally risky, exceptionally expensive. And, for that reason, he stayed in a wheelchair. What had happened was a few years before I had met him, he was going to answer the front door. He was staying with one of my uncles and other family members, relatives, but he went to go answer the front door late at night. And when he did that, he noticed that the two people that were knocking on the door, they had their own pew-pews. Again, hate that word, but just bear with me. When he saw that they were carrying those things, he went and slammed the door, or so I was told, and he turned around and tried to run. And those people unloaded on him through the door, striking him several times in the back, including in the spine. And it was difficult because he was also a single parent. His ex, who had a kid with him, just kind of abandoned them. I think it's important to know that those men were actually there to unalive one of my uncles. Anyways, fast forward, him and my mother meet in this house, and I met him, and to be honest, he was so nice. I remember he would always play with us. He would help us with our homework because he wasn't really working too much. He was always home, so he would watch us a lot. And even one time, I was choking on a hot dog as this 6-7-year-old, and he came, saved the day, gave me the Heimlich maneuver. I loved him. He was family, and I loved him as a father figure. And my mother and him hit it off, and they started dating, and very quickly they got married. And when they got married, they did their best to try to give us a good life. Which is crazy considering everything that I'm about to tell you that went down. But what that included was they got some really good jobs working in sales, and they made a decent income. We were always, on and off food stamps, but they made enough to rent a house just a few doors down on the same street as everybody else, so we were still a big, happy family. And this is where it gets really interesting and really freaking crazy. Because as we were starting to have this normal kind of family, now it's, my mom, my stepdad, my brother, and now my stepbrother. I'm just going to call them my dad and my brother for now because, to be honest, that's who they are to me because I grew up with them. But now that we had this extra house in our family, we had more room to do things. So we had so many family get-togethers, not just from everyone that was living with us, but even more extended family would come over. And it was interesting because I didn't really understand what was going on because this was my everyday norm. But very often on the weekends, we would have family come over. All the men, the grown-ups, would be in the garage. Either they'd be smoking stuff that they're not supposed to, doing stuff that they're not supposed to, drinking a lot, and they would be doing playing dominoes or poker and stuff like that. And the ladies would either sit in there with them or they would be inside on the couch talking to each other, while us kids would do everything that we thought was cool. Now, keep in mind, all we had as examples for what it meant to be men, for the most part, were the men in our family. Now, before we get into all that craziness, I'm going to be uploading that on the next video because I am starting to run out of recording time here. But with that being said, stick around for that. Again, huge shout out to Risa Tisa, who inspired me to be, vulnerable and share my story. Now, stick around. I'm going to try to upload this next one in the next hour or two.